Settle into the quietest part of your room and let the weight of the day rest somewhere beyond the blankets. Allow your breathing to grow unhurried as we travel, very gently, toward the walls and courtyards of an imperial palace before sunrise. Nothing in this journey needs to be remembered, and no doorway needs to be reached before you are ready. Tonight, we will follow the workers whose patient routines allowed the Forbidden City to wake, move, and eventually become still again. I'm the Yawning Historian. Our journey begins in the Qing dynasty, during a calm hour that does not belong to one precise date or reign. It is a composite morning, assembled from rules and records that describe guarded entrances, identity badges, formal movement, and work performed in shifts. The exact arrangements could change with the gate, the season, the rank of a traveler, and the needs of the court. Even so, the underlying rhythm remained recognizable. Entry into the palace was controlled, passage was observed, and every opening door depended upon people who had risen before many others. Before dawn, the great walls would have been dark shapes against a dark sky. Their red surfaces, so vivid in daylight, might have appeared almost brown or black in the thin blue hour. Roof tiles rested above them in long, quiet lines. Stone paving held the coolness of the night, and the broad approaches, which later could fill with measured activity, still offered long stretches of emptiness. We may imagine a faint wind moving beneath the eaves and touching the sleeves of a guard who had learned to stand without wasting motion. The Forbidden City was not simply a collection of splendid halls. It was also a regulated environment in which access depended on identity, office, rank, and purpose. A gate was therefore more than an architectural opening. It was a place of decision, repetition, and careful attention. People approached, paused, presented the means by which they could be recognized, and continued only when the rules allowed it. The work could be quiet, yet it was never meaningless. A person checking entry helped maintain the boundary between the imperial household and the much larger city beyond its walls. Some guards worked while the palace slept, and others arrived to take their places as darkness began to soften. The surviving descriptions tell us that guards served in shifts, which meant that a change of watch was itself part of the daily machinery. One group did not simply vanish when another appeared. Duties had to pass from tired hands to rested ones. Information, however ordinary, had to remain continuous. A gate that had been quiet, a person expected later, or an instruction passed down through an office could all belong to the small exchange between one watch and the next. In this reconstruction, the relief guard approaches across the stone at an even pace. His clothing is suited to regulation rather than display, and the early air settles cool against cloth and leather. There is no need to give him a name, for the record does not offer one for this particular morning. He stands here as one among many workers whose individual footsteps were absorbed into the institution. The guard finishing his watch shifts his weight, perhaps warming one hand against the other, then returns his attention to the gate until the transfer is complete. The sounds are modest. A sole touches paving. Fabric brushes fabric. A low voice gives a report without ornament. Somewhere close by, a fitting of wood or metal answers with a small, dull sound. None of it carries the bright edge of ceremony. This is maintenance, and maintenance often speaks softly. It is the sound of a place continuing from one hour into another. Beyond certain points, officials were expected to dismount and proceed on foot. The rule placed even important visitors into a slower relationship with the palace. A horse, chair, or other conveyance could carry someone toward authority, but it could not necessarily carry him through every guarded boundary. At the required place, movement changed. Feet met stone, garments settled after the descent, and the remaining distance had to be crossed at a human pace. The exact dismounting point depended upon the rule and the route. It would be misleading to imagine one identical procedure imposed at every opening in every period. Yet the larger principle was clear. At the gate, this small object connected a living person to an administrative identity. The badge was not merely decorative. It supported the ordinary labor of recognition, allowing guards to compare the person before them with the office and permission he claimed. A court filled with ranks, departments, and obligations depended upon such modest instruments. Grand government often rested on things that fit into the hand. We may picture the badge offered in the dimness, though the exact gesture belongs to reconstruction. A guard receives or examines it with practiced attention. The surface catches little light. The official waits. Behind him, perhaps, an attendant holds still, and farther away the avenue remains quiet. The pause may last only a short while, but it is part of the gate's work. A name must become a recognized person, a title must correspond to a permitted route, and the opening beyond must remain controlled. There was dignity in the slowness of this exchange. No one needed to rush merely because the hour was early. The palace had been designed around thresholds, courtyards, and successive layers of approach. Progress was often measured not by speed, but by permission. One crossed a space, reached a boundary, waited, and crossed again. The body moved through administration as surely as a document moved through an office. At a major gate during daylight, one surviving account describes more than a dozen guards on duty. That figure should remain attached to the setting in which it was recorded, rather than becoming account for every gate and every hour. Some entrances were more important than others. Staffing could respond to place, time, and circumstance. Still, the account helps us understand that guarding a palace entrance was collective labor. A gate did not depend on a single picturesque sentry standing alone beneath an enormous roof. There were people to watch the approaches, people to attend to the passage itself, and people working within a hierarchy that connected one shift to another. Their presence turned architecture into a functioning boundary. Without them, a closed door was only heavy wood, and an open one was only empty space. With them, the threshold became an organized point in the life of the court. The guards themselves belonged to rules of identity and rank. They were not interchangeable shadows. Assignments and authority could differ, and the palace expected conduct suited to duty. We do not need to invent a complete schedule to understand the demands. Waiting was part of the work. Remaining attentive through long, quiet stretches was part of the work. Recognizing who might pass, and under what conditions, was part of the work. Opening and closing, reporting and observing, standing and walking were all forms of labor. Waiting can be difficult to see in history because it leaves fewer objects than construction or craft. Yet much of palace life depended upon trained waiting. A guard waited without abandoning readiness. An official waited without assuming that title alone would carry him forward. An attendant waited at the edge of permission. The gate gathered these pauses and placed them in order. As the sky slowly lightens, the details of the entrance return one by one. The edge of a roof becomes distinct. A paving stone shows a pale seam. Painted surfaces gather muted color. In our bounded reconstruction, a guard notices these changes without staring at them. He has seen dawn arrive many times, although not every dawn has felt the same. Winter light might come slowly over bitter stone, while summer air could already carry a trace of warmth. Season mattered to bodies even when regulation remained written in steady language. Sleeves could feel heavy in damp weather. Breath could show in cold air. Rain might darken the paving and soften distant footfalls. Dust could settle during dry days. None of these sensations proves the weather of a particular recorded shift. They simply remind us that rules were carried out by people standing in real courtyards under changing skies. The gate itself demanded attention as a physical object. Large doors and their fittings had weight. Opening a passage was an action rather than an idea. We may imagine hands placed where practice had taught them, a measured push or pull, and the low response of wood moving on its supports. There is no need to make the sound thunder. At this hour, it might seem broad and deep, then fade quickly into the open space. The opening did not mean that anyone could enter. It prepared a controlled route for those whose presence had been recognized. The guards remained the human part of the threshold. Their labor continued after the doors moved, because a boundary must be watched whether it is closed or open. In this way, the palace began its day not with a single dramatic awakening, but with many small permissions. An official who had dismounted continued on foot. His path led through scale itself. Walls rose high, courtyards spread wide, and the next gate might stand at a distance that invited a steady pace. Shoes met stone again and again. The person crossing this space could hold a significant title, yet for these few minutes he was also simply a figure walking beneath a large sky. The rhythm of walking suited the palace. It gave time for clothing to settle and breath to even out. It placed intervals between one administrative boundary and the next. An official might know his route well, but familiarity did not erase formality. Repetition made procedure smoother, not unnecessary. At the gate, identity checking also protected the work occurring within. The inner court, outer court, offices, storerooms, residences, and service areas did not form one undifferentiated world. Different people had reasons to be in different places. Rank influenced access, and purpose mattered. A worker allowed through one passage was not thereby free to wander every courtyard. The palace was arranged by layers of permission. This careful separation required knowledge. Guards had to recognize procedures and respond to the forms of proof used by the institution. Officials and attendants had to know where to pause, where to dismount, and where to continue on foot. Repeated compliance saved explanation. The system became embodied in habits, in the angle of an approach, in the moment a badge was made ready, and in the slight slowing of steps before a checkpoint. Administrative order can sound dry when reduced to regulations. At ground level, however, it consisted of people moving objects and bodies through space. A badge traveled from a holder toward an inspecting hand. A message passed from one shift to another. A door moved from closed to open. A visitor crossed from outside to inside. Each action was plain, and together they gave the court its morning shape. The Imperial Household Department would connect many of the workers we will meet later, overseeing broad areas of palace service, people, property, and supply. At the gates, other chains of command and guard arrangements helped control the approaches. The institutions did not dissolve into one another, and every worker did not answer to the same immediate office. What joined them was dependence. The activity inside could proceed only when the controlled boundaries around it continued to function. By now, more footsteps begin to appear in our imagined morning. They do not arrive as a crowd all at once. One small group crosses a distant stretch of paving. A person pauses while another is checked. Someone who has completed a night duty turns toward rest. Someone beginning a day duty settles into the posture of attention. The palace wakes by accumulation. There may be a soft scrape as a shoe adjusts on stone, the brief clearing of a throat, and the subdued exchange of formal words. Sounds travel easily across large courtyards before they are absorbed by walls and roofs. Even then, there are generous spaces between them. Silence is not broken so much as rearranged. The men at the gate had their own fatigue, discomfort, and private thoughts, though the official record rarely preserves these in a form that permits certainty. A long shift could make the legs heavy. Cold could find the fingers. Homes and family concerns existed beyond the wall. It is reasonable to remember these human conditions, while resisting the urge to assign an invented life to one unnamed guard. The calmest history can leave room for people without pretending to know everything they felt. Some shifts must have passed without unusual incident. Such uneventful hours were not failures of history. They were evidence that routine held. The badge matched, the permitted person passed, the doors functioned, and the next watch arrived. Nothing astonishing happened, and because nothing astonishing happened, a large and complicated household could continue. Routine also contained correction. A person who approached the wrong point could be redirected. Someone without proper recognition could be made to wait or denied passage according to the rules in force. A guard uncertain of an instruction could refer upward within the working hierarchy. The surviving descriptions support controlled entry, though they do not give us every exchange. We should therefore leave individual conversations indistinct, like voices heard from another courtyard. The visual grandeur of the Forbidden City can make its daily labor seem small. Yet monumental space increases the amount of work required to regulate it. Long distances must be crossed. Multiple thresholds must be attended. Messages must travel. Changes of shift must occur without leaving a gap. An impressive gate remains useful only when people are there to operate and observe it. We can linger beside one such threshold as morning takes on a little more color. The guard stands near timber marked by generations of weather and care. Metal fittings remain cool. The stone below has been worn not by one legendary event, but by innumerable ordinary crossings. A palace is preserved in records and objects, but it was once renewed each day by footsteps. One pair of those footsteps belongs to an official continuing inward. The new watch remains. Sunlight has not yet warmed the broad stone, but the darkness has lifted enough to show red walls, pale paving, and the layered outlines of roofs. The guards continue their quiet work beneath them. They do not need to dominate the scene. Their value lies precisely in steady presence. Bad weather would add another layer of simple responsibility. Rain could make a badge or written instruction harder to handle, and wet paving could slow an approach. Snow or frost could narrow the comfortable places to stand. The records used here do not preserve the weather for our composite morning, so we need not choose one. We can simply notice that guarded procedure had to continue through conditions that architecture could soften, but never completely remove. The gate also linked time as carefully as it linked space. One watch inherited the duty of the last, and a later watch would inherit it in turn. A visitor saw only the few moments of his own inspection, while the guards held the longer sequence around him. Their work began before he appeared and continued after his footsteps disappeared. We will leave the gate without forcing it closed behind us. Its sounds can grow softer while our attention moves deeper into the inner court, where cloth is being unfolded and another kind of service is beginning. There is no hurry at all, only cooler stone beneath fading footsteps and the first muted warmth gathering under the eaves. Deeper within the palace, the scale of gates and courtyards gradually gave way to rooms where work was measured in smaller movements. Cloth had to be aired, folded, carried, and returned. Tea had to arrive with the proper degree of care. Objects belonging to the court had to remain accounted for, even when they passed through many hands. In these quieter spaces, palace maids served within an ordered household whose distinctions of rank shaped assignments, access, and daily obligation. This account remains centered on the Qing dynasty, while allowing for change across more than 2.5 centuries. Selection practices, titles, and household arrangements did not remain perfectly fixed from one reign to another. Surviving records also describe institutions more readily than they preserve the thoughts of every young woman who entered them. We can follow the documented outlines of service, and where we add a sound, a texture, or an ordinary gesture, we will keep it as a careful reconstruction. Surviving Qing palace records describe palace maids as being selected from girls of bondservant households attached to the upper three banners under the Imperial Household Department. This was a specific social and administrative setting, not a description of every woman who lived or worked within the Forbidden City. A palace maid was not the same as an imperial consort, a consort candidate, or every kind of female official and lady-in-waiting mentioned across court history. The boundaries could be complicated, but flattening them would hide more than it explained. The Imperial Household Department served as an important thread through this world. It managed broad areas of inter-court personnel, property, supply, and service. The girls selected through its banner households entered a structure that already knew their family registration and administrative category. Their arrival was therefore both personal and bureaucratic. A young person crossed into unfamiliar rooms, while an office recorded another assignment within the household. We should not romanticize that crossing. Service inside a palace could place someone near fine textiles and carefully made objects, yet beauty did not erase constraint. Selection was tied to status and obligation, and the young women did not all arrive through free individual choice as that phrase might be understood today. The surviving institutional language can make the process seem smooth. Behind it were separations from familiar homes, adaptation to discipline, and the need to learn quickly. Some accounts of Qing court women note that certain ladies-in-waiting served for a term and could return to their families. That detail should remain properly bounded. It does not mean that every female attendant held the same position, followed one fixed length of service, or experienced departure in the same way. It does, however, remind us that palace service could be a period within a life rather than the whole of it. On an early day of training, a new entrant might first notice surfaces. The floor beneath her shoes is firm and cool. The room carries the mild scent of stored cloth, wood, and perhaps warm water. Sleeves move with a faint whisper when people turn. These sensations are reconstructed, but the tasks they surround are grounded in descriptions of senior women teaching newcomers etiquette and grooming. Learning etiquette meant learning how rank became visible in motion. A person did not simply enter a room, place an object anywhere, or address everyone in the same manner. She learned where to stand, how to wait, when to approach, and how to handle the items entrusted to her. The lesson could be repeated until the body remembered what the mind once had to recite. Senior women were essential to this transfer of knowledge. Regulations could establish expectations, but experienced workers showed how expectations were carried through actual rooms. A novice watched the angle at which cloth was held, the pace suited to a corridor, and the quiet readiness expected near someone of higher rank. Instruction passed from one generation of service to another through correction, demonstration, and repetition. Grooming was part of that training because appearance within the court was regulated and meaningful. Hair, clothing, and personal neatness belonged to the visible order of the household. It would be unsafe to invent one universal lesson for every period, but it is reasonable to imagine patient practice before a polished metal mirror, a senior woman adjusting a detail, and a newcomer trying again. The point was not private fashion. It was suitability to place and duty. Rank shaped the number of attendants assigned to different members of the imperial family and court. The highest-ranking household did not receive precisely the same allocation as every lesser household. This meant that for attendants, that meant that care of objects belonged to a cycle of issue, use, return, inspection, and storage. An inventory can seem far from the warmth of human life, but it often protected continuity. Someone had to know what had entered a room and what had left it. Someone had to notice a missing container, a worn textile, or an item awaiting return. Written records and physical checking met in the hands of workers. A list was useful only when a person compared it with the object before her. We may imagine a small stack of folded cloth beside a register, though the precise form of one day's paperwork is not given to us. A clerk or responsible attendant marks what can be marked. Another woman counts softly, perhaps touching each folded edge in turn. The room remains calm because counting itself creates a rhythm. Tea service created a different rhythm, warmer and more immediate. Water had to be heated and carried, leaves and vessels made ready, and the service delivered according to place and rank. No one exact timetable needs to be imposed across every residence. At some hour in some household, an attendant waited for the appropriate moment, listening for instruction and watching the steam diminish. Tea required attention to objects that could be small and fragile. Cups, lids, trays, cloths, and containers moved through several stages before returning to storage or cleaning. A tray had weight, even when it looked delicate. Hot water required steadiness. The person carrying it adjusted her pace to protect both the vessel and the people nearby. In a quiet corridor, reconstructed light falls along the edge of the tray. The maid's steps are short enough to remain balanced. Her sleeves are arranged so that they do not brush the vessels. At a doorway she pauses, not because history needs suspense, but because palace etiquette often turned waiting into part of service. Permission to enter mattered as much as readiness outside. The tea itself might be received without notice of the labor behind it. This is common in households of every scale. When service succeeds, the water is warm, the cup is present, and the tray is removed before it becomes an obstruction. The sequence disappears into comfort. Only when something is late, missing, or misplaced does the work become visible. Palace maids also served emperors, empresses, consorts, princes, and palace offices according to assignment. These categories should not be treated as one identical household. The expectations near an emperor differed from those in a prince's residence or an administrative room. Access could be more restricted, etiquette more layered, and responsibility divided differently. Rank did not merely change ornament. It shaped the organization of people. A novice learned these differences gradually. At first, every corridor may have seemed similar, every doorway severe, every instruction easy to confuse. Repetition turned a maze into a set of routes. She came to know where clean cloth waited, where used items were gathered, where a tray could be set down, and where silence was expected. This growing knowledge was a form of skilled labor. The palace depended upon memory, yet memory was supported by hierarchy and record. Senior women corrected younger attendants. Offices maintained allocations and property. Objects returned to known places. The system did not always work perfectly, and the surviving record does not justify an image of flawless obedience. People became tired, misunderstood, fell ill, resisted, and longed for home. A large institution contained strain even when its official rules described order. Accounts of palace service often preserved discipline more clearly than affection or friendship. It would be easy to fill the silence with invented confidences, but a bounded history leaves private relationships partly private. The young women certainly lived among other people, and ordinary human connections were likely to form. We can acknowledge companionship, tension, teaching, and homesickness as possibilities without assigning a particular whispered conversation to an unnamed maid. The workday could involve long periods in which readiness mattered more than visible action. A maid might stand nearby while a higher-ranking person rested, dressed, received something, or waited for another office. She was present so that a need could be answered. Like the guards at the gate, she practiced attentive waiting, though in a different space and under a different hierarchy. Waiting indoors had its own sensations. Air near a brazier might be warm while a corridor remained cool. A sleeve folded over the hands could soften the chill. In summer, still air might make heavy cloth tiring. These are seasonal reconstructions rather than records of one chamber. They help us remember that etiquette was performed by bodies that felt temperature, thirst, and fatigue. The most repetitive tasks often demanded the greatest reliability. Folding a cloth once was easy. Folding many items consistently, keeping categories separate, and placing each where it could be found again required sustained attention. Carrying one cup was simple. Carrying trays day after day without careless collision required practice. Polishing, sorting, airing, and counting made no grand story, yet they preserved the court's material life. Textiles connected intimate service with distant systems of production and supply. The palace was not a world sealed away from everything beyond its walls. Materials entered through wider networks, were assigned by offices, used in households, repaired when possible, and stored or reassigned. The maid who folded a garment stood near one point in that long chain. Her hands were local, while the object carried the work of many people elsewhere. This is one reason not to describe palace women as decorative background. Their labor maintained the visible signs by which the court represented rank and order. A robe looked ready because someone had prepared it. A chamber appeared composed because someone had removed what did not belong. A vessel returned to storage because someone remembered that it was court property. The smooth surface of ceremony rested upon uncelebrated preparation. The work also demanded discretion. Service brought attendants close to private spaces, personal belongings, and moments not intended for a wider audience. Regulations and hierarchy governed what could be seen, carried, or repeated. We do not need tales of gossip to make this interesting. Quiet reliability was itself a valuable palace skill. Imagine, gently and without claiming an exact scene, a senior attendant walking through a room after preparations are complete. She looks at the line of folded cloth, the placement of a tray, and the cleared surface beside a couch. Her inspection is brief because experience notices proportion quickly. One item is moved the width of a hand. The room settles into readiness. The newcomer watches. She has learned that readiness has no single dramatic moment. It grows from dozens of corrections too small for a chronicle. A hem lies flat. A lid sits properly. A route remains unobstructed. Hands are clean. A required object can be found without searching. At another time, property might leave the room and return to a store. Court ownership continued even when an object had spent months or years in one household. The return called for checking. Where had to be recognized, sets kept together where appropriate, and future reassignment made possible. Attendants lived among beautiful things, but their relationship to those things was often custodial rather than possessive. There is a gentle sadness in that distinction, though we should not impose one feeling on every worker. To care closely for something one did not own could produce pride, indifference, anxiety, or a mixture that changed by the day. The records tell us more about the object's administrative status than about the maid's heart. We can let that silence remain. Terms of service, where they applied, placed time around palace life. A girl entering service could become a more experienced woman and perhaps later return to her family. The world outside would not have paused in her absence. Relatives aged, households changed, and familiar streets might feel different. Yet she could carry home practical knowledge, memories, habits of posture, and a sense of rooms that most people would never enter. For others, circumstances and categories differed. The broad label of palace woman covers lives that should not be merged. Some held higher statuses, some more formal authority, some more precarious positions. Our focus remains on maids selected and assigned within the Qing household system, while recognizing the limits of that frame. By late morning in our composite day, the rooms have passed through several cycles of preparation. Clothing has been handled. Tea has traveled and returned. Small objects have changed position and then found their assigned places. Nothing in the scene announces the amount of attention required. Order looks natural only after people have worked to create it. An attendant carries a bundle of folded cloth along a sheltered passage. The weight rests against her forearms. The fabric holds a little warmth from the room she has left, while the corridor air is cooler. She knows the route, so her eyes do not search at every turning. Knowledge has settled into her steps. Near another doorway, a younger worker waits. She listens to the soft instruction of a senior woman and adjusts the edge of her sleeve. There is no sharp reprimand in our reconstruction, only the steady correction through which skill is learned. The movement is repeated once, then accepted. The Imperial Household Department's records could classify, allocate, and account, but daily service still moved from person to person. Administration reached the room through assignments, supplies, property rules, and hierarchy. The room answered through completed tasks. Between them stood workers whose names often faded from the surviving narrative. Care also included noticing when an object had reached the limit of ordinary household attention. A damaged fastening, frayed edge, or cracked container might need to pass toward a repair office or store rather than being quietly ignored. The attendant who recognized the problem did not necessarily repair it herself. Her skill lay in seeing, separating, and reporting, so that another specialized worker could take over without losing the object inside the larger system. This handoff joined domestic rooms to storerooms and workshops. It also prevented us from imagining palace service as a set of isolated occupations. The maid, clerk, storekeeper, porter, and artisan could touch different stages of one object's life, while remaining distinct workers with different authority. We can remember them without pretending to recover every biography. It is enough to notice the cloth held carefully, the tea carried steadily, the inventory checked, and the newcomer guided by someone who had once been new herself. These gestures reveal the household at work more clearly than an invented secret ever could. The hours continue, but our attention can grow lighter. A final length of fabric is folded along a familiar crease, then placed with the others. Warmth leaves the tea tray, footsteps thin along the corridor, and the room returns to its patient order. There is no hurry at all as we move onward. The cloth lies still, the inventory rests closed, and beyond the doorway another corridor waits in dimmer light for the messengers, lamp tenders, and storeroom workers who pass through it. The corridors of the Qing Palace connected spaces that were meant to remain distinct. A residence required supplies from elsewhere. An office needed a message carried across a courtyard. A locked room had to be opened for an authorized purpose and secured again afterward. Lamps needed tending when daylight failed. Within these repeated movements, eunuchs performed many kinds of service under the supervision and regulations of the imperial household. This story stays with the ordinary work that made the court depend upon palace eunuchs, leaving aside the theatrical caricatures that have so often surrounded them. The surviving records allow us to look at supervision, hierarchy, education, discipline, staffing difficulties, and the recurring fact that some workers left service. We will keep variations of reign and office in view, because there was no single routine shared unchanged by every eunuch across the Qing dynasty. The Imperial Household Department was the central supervisory body for much of this service. Its reach connected personnel to rooms, objects, supplies, and rules. Beneath broad administration were more immediate layers of authority. Eunuchs could hold different ranks and assignments, and a worker near a storeroom did not necessarily perform the same duties as one carrying messages or serving within a residence. Hierarchy shaped who gave instructions, who received them, and who bore responsibility when a task was missed. It could also shape access and assignment according to the arrangements of a particular period. We should not invent a perfectly stable ladder for the whole dynasty. It is enough to understand that eunuch service was organized, unequal, and closely supervised. In our composite day, a corridor lies half-lit between an open courtyard and a shadowed doorway. The paving is pale where morning reaches it and gray where the roof holds the shade. A worker crosses with a message protected inside his clothing or a small case. The exact object and route are reconstructed, while the service of carrying messages belongs securely to the practical world described by palace records. A message could be brief and still matter. A household requested an item. An office confirmed an instruction. A room needed to be made ready. The person carrying the words did not create the decision, but he made distance less troublesome. Without couriers, the palace's many separated spaces would have remained isolated islands of authority. Carrying a message involved more than walking quickly. The worker had to know the approved route and the place of delivery. He had to protect the content from loss or careless repetition. He might need to wait until the proper person could receive it. The task ended only when words had reached the next responsible link. Movement through the palace was conditioned by access. Eunuchs serving in inner spaces could pass where many outside officials could not, but that did not give every eunuch unrestricted freedom. Assignment mattered. Rank mattered. The needs of a residence or office mattered. A worker might know one network of corridors intimately while rarely entering another. The architecture taught these boundaries through repetition. Turn at a particular wall. Pause beside a particular threshold. Use one door for service and leave another to a higher-ranking passage. Knowledge lived in the feet as well as the mind. After enough journeys, a worker could measure distance by roof shadows, paving joints, and the changing sound of his steps. Doors created another field of labor. Some opened into rooms of daily use, others towards stores, offices, or enclosed passages. An authorized door had to be available when needed and secured when use ended. Keys, seals, verbal instructions, and records could play different roles depending on place and period. The sources do not justify one universal procedure, so our scene remains deliberately modest. A eunuch arrives at a storeroom with another worker nearby. They confirm the purpose of entry according to the practice of their office. One fastening moves, then another. Wood gives a soft answer. Cool, still air waits beyond. This is reconstructed texture surrounding a documented category of palace work, not an eyewitness account of a particular opening. Inside, objects rest in arrangements meant to make future use possible. Some have been wrapped, stacked, boxed, or placed on shelves. A worker must distinguish what can be issued from what must remain. If an item leaves, someone may need to record or report the movement. If it returns, condition and completeness matter. Storeroom service required memory supported by administration. A person learned the shape of a collection, yet he could not rely upon memory alone. Palace property belonged to systems of custody. Clerks, storekeepers, eunuch liaisons, and supervisors could all participate in different parts of that system. No one worker represented the whole chain. The room may smell faintly of wood, cloth wrapping, and settled dust. Light reaches only the nearest surfaces. We can imagine the worker lifting a small box with both hands, feeling its weight before carrying it toward the door. He does not open it out of curiosity. His task is transfer, and reliability is measured by the object arriving as it left. Elsewhere, another eunuch attends to lamps. Lamp service was not a single action performed only at night. Vessels and tools had to be available. Fuel or candles had to be supplied according to the type of light in use. Wicks might require trimming, surfaces cleaning, and spent material removing. The exact sequence varied, but the broader need was constant in an age when darkness returned each evening without electric light. During the day, lamp equipment could be inspected and readied. A worker might wipe soot from a surface or carry a lamp to the place assigned to it. Fire demanded respect in a palace built largely from timber. Careless handling could threaten far more than one room. Tending light was therefore both domestic service and quiet protection. Our reconstructed lamp tender works beside a doorway where daylight is sufficient. A cloth moves over metal or another smooth surface. The old residue darkens the cloth. Nearby, a tool rests where it can be found again. There is nothing dramatic in the preparation. Its purpose is to prevent drama later. As evening approached, lamps would create small pools of visibility along interiors and passages. They did not turn night into day. A worker carrying light had to move at the pace permitted by flame. Air from an open court could make it tremble. A hand or shade protected it, and the surrounding darkness seemed to shift with every step. Eunuchs also served at doors within residences and ceremonial areas, waited for instructions, relayed requests, and helped move objects from one office to another. These tasks changed with assignment. A worker attached to a particular household could become familiar with its preferences and rhythms. Another in an administrative setting might spend more time near documents, registers, and supervisors. The court depended upon this proximity, and proximity did not automatically become political mastery. Later stories have often turned every palace eunuch into a hidden ruler or comic schemer. The record does not support such a universal claim. Individuals could gain influence in particular circumstances, while many others performed limited duties within strict hierarchies. Ordinary dependence and extraordinary influence should not be confused. Indeed, regulations reveal concern about control. Supervision, discipline, and rank were not empty ideas. Instructions existed because the institution expected workers to follow boundaries, and enforcement existed because people did not always do so. Palace labor was human labor. It included mistakes, avoidance, conflict, illness, and departure alongside obedience. Surviving scholarship documents persistent labor shortages associated with eunuchs leaving service. This is an important counterweight to the image of a sealed institution from which personal will entirely disappeared. Departure could occur despite rules and supervision. The records allow us to speak of staffing difficulties in flight, though not to assign one motive to every person who left. Homesickness is one plausible part of that human landscape, and the scholarship supports treating it with care. A worker might miss family, familiar streets, or a life beyond regulated walls. Other reasons may have existed where no surviving file makes them clear. The responsible phrasing is that records suggest strain and recurring departures, not that all eunuchs felt one emotion. Labor shortage had practical consequences. An unfilled place did not erase the task attached to it. Messages still needed carrying. Doors still needed watching. Lamps still needed preparation. Stores still needed attending. Work could fall more heavily on those who remained or force supervisors to adjust assignments. This reveals dependence from an unexpected angle. The palace could issue rules, but it could not create unlimited experienced labor simply by writing another instruction. Workers had to be recruited, trained, assigned, supported, and retained. When people left, the institution noticed because its routines became harder to sustain. We may imagine a supervisor reviewing an assignment list, though the precise document before him is not known. One corridor post lacks a worker. A messenger is needed elsewhere. A junior person receives a temporary instruction and bows before setting off. The scene is a bounded reconstruction of the administrative problem, not proof of one particular response. Training helped turn new or reassigned workers into useful members of the system. Records note eunuch schools within the Qing palace. Their existence tells us that education was treated institutionally, but it does not prove that every eunuch attended the same lessons, reached the same level, or followed one curriculum throughout the dynasty. Instruction may have included literacy and knowledge relevant to palace rules or service, depending on school, period, and position. We should leave details where the research is not specific. What matters is the recognition that some palace work required more than physical presence. Messages, names, offices, lists, and regulations rewarded the ability to understand written or formal material. In a quiet schoolroom of our reconstruction, a brush rests above paper. Characters already copied begin to dry. A teacher or more advanced figure corrects the form of a stroke. Outside, a corridor continues its ordinary traffic. The learner bends again to the task, not as a symbol of every eunuch, but as one possible participant in the documented educational institution. Learning could change the range of work available to a person. Someone able to read an instruction or assist with records could serve differently from someone assigned mainly to carrying, cleaning, or guarding an interior point. Rank and patronage also mattered, and ability alone did not dissolve hierarchy. Even so, education added another kind of labor to palace life, the slow labor of memorizing, copying, and correcting. Schools also required time. A worker at a lesson was not simultaneously carrying a tray or standing at a door. The institution had to balance preparation with immediate need. Persistent shortages may have made that balance difficult in some periods. Again, the records hint at a system adapting rather than a machine functioning without friction. The word discipline can sound loud, but much discipline was probably repetitive. Report at the proper place. Wear what regulation required. Follow the assigned route. Address superiors appropriately. Return an object. Do not remain where permission ends. Small corrections accumulated into the institutional behavior expected of service. Consequences for violation could be serious, but this sleep journey has no need to dwell on punishment. It is enough to know that supervision carried force and that workers understood the unequal power around them. Their calm outward routines existed within constraints. A quiet corridor was not necessarily a carefree one. At the same time, workers developed practical competence that regulations alone could not supply. An experienced messenger knew which route became crowded. A lamp tender recognized a wick that would burn poorly. A storeroom attendant remembered how a wrapped object should feel when complete. A door attendant noticed when an instruction differed from usual practice. This practical knowledge made the court reliant on individuals even when official language treated positions as replaceable. A new worker could occupy a post, but experience took time. When people fled or staffing fell short, the loss included habits and memory. The institution had to rebuild those quietly. Consider one ordinary circuit through the palace. A eunuch receives a request near a residence. He walks beneath a covered passage, crosses a courtyard, waits at an office, and carries back an answer. On the return, he delivers a small object from a store because the two tasks can be joined. This exact circuit is imagined, yet every part reflects the linked service that allowed distant rooms to function together. His steps change with the surface. Stone gives one sound, packed earth or another floor another. Under a roof, the noise returns faintly from timber. In open air, it thins. These sensory details do not claim a dated event. They simply give scale to the distances hidden inside the word service. He passes other workers without merging into their roles. A guard belongs to the gate and its chain of duty. A palace maid carries cloth toward a household room. A porter bears a heavier load. A clerk remains beside records. The eunuch's access and assignment distinguish him, just as rank and office distinguish one eunuch from another. Near midday, a doorway opens to receive the message. The recipient listens or reads, then gives a short response. The messenger does not decorate it. Accuracy is a form of service. He repeats only what is needed and begins the return journey. There were undoubtedly moments of conversation, humor, irritation, and friendship among eunuchs, but surviving administrative records cannot recover them evenly. Caricature often rushes to fill that absence. We can choose patience instead. A worker may be remembered through the tasks the institution repeatedly needed, even when his private voice is gone. One clue to private experience is departure itself. Rules against leaving and records of shortages show that not everyone remained where supervisors expected. Flight interrupted the ideal picture of complete control. Each absence carried an individual story, but the archive may reduce it to a staffing problem. The gap between those two scales is worth holding gently. For the office, a missing worker meant another blank in an assignment. For the person, it may have meant a road, a family, uncertainty, or simply distance from the palace. We cannot know which image belongs to which case. The record gives us the outline, and compassion can remain quiet inside it without inventing details. Back in the corridor, those who remain continue. A lamp is moved to storage until evening. A door is secured after an item passes. A message reaches its destination. A junior worker practices a written character. None of these actions rules an empire, yet each supports the rooms in which imperial decisions are made. The distinction matters. Power and service can stand close together without becoming the same thing. A person who entered restricted rooms might have little control over his own assignment. A worker who carried an order did not necessarily shape its content. Nearness to authority could bring opportunity for some and burden for many. As afternoon light shifts, the covered passages lengthen their shadows. The worker who began with a message now crosses more slowly, perhaps because the day has gathered in his legs. He keeps the required pace and holds the object securely. Fatigue does not cancel procedure. Another shift or assignment may take over part of the work. The exact schedule is left open because offices and periods differed. Continuity remains the central need. A corridor cannot carry a message by itself, and a lamp does not prepare itself for dusk. Someone must be ready when the next request arrives. Short staffing could make this continuity especially fragile. A supervisor might combine errands, delay a less urgent transfer, or place an inexperienced worker beside someone who knew the route. These responses are reasonable reconstruction rather than a recorded plan for one day. They show why departures became an administrative subject at all. The palace noticed absence through work that waited. For the junior worker, taking an unfamiliar route meant learning under pressure. He watched where the experienced man paused and how permission was confirmed at a doorway. A simple delivery became a lesson outside the schoolroom. Institutional education and daily imitation could meet in the same pair of footsteps. By repeating the route, he slowly turned borrowed knowledge into habit. The next time a request came, less explanation was needed. This was how a strained system could regain a little steadiness, not all at once, but through another worker becoming dependable in one small part of the palace. Soon the palace kitchens and storehouses will offer other sounds: the wash of rice, the settling of fuel, and the careful movement of bowls and water jars. Cooks, stove workers, clerks, and porters retained their distinct expertise beyond the corridor duties followed here. The palace worked through connected systems without making every worker interchangeable. For now, we can let this corridor become dim. The open store has been checked and secured. The message has reached the room that needed it, and the cleaned lamp waits for evening. Footsteps pass once beneath the eaves, then soften into cooler stone and a quieter stretch of shade. There is no need to follow them quickly. The door settles against its frame. The last small echo fades, and somewhere beyond the wall a kitchen fire rests beneath pale ash, waiting for the next unhurried task. Beyond the quieter corridors, where messages had passed from hand to hand and lamps had been carried from one doorway to another, the palace day continued in rooms that smelled of water, grain, warm clay, and slowly settling smoke. The kitchens and storehouses of the Qing court did not form one enormous hearth from which every bowl emerged. Food service was divided among offices and rooms with different responsibilities. Some arrangements served the emperor, some supported tea, some attended to the inner or outer court, and others supplied princes, guards, or particular ceremonial needs. The details changed with reign, season, rank, and purpose, yet the larger pattern remained steady. An imperial meal depended upon many people who measured, recorded, washed, lifted, heated, covered, carried, received, and returned. The imperial household department stood behind much of this work, joining the private needs of the ruling household to offices, supplies, accounts, and labor. The court of imperial entertainments also had responsibilities in court food administration. Their names suggested grandeur, yet a large part of their business rested on ordinary materials. Rice had to be dry before it was washed. Water had to arrive before a kettle could be filled. Fuel had to be counted, stored, and brought close to the stove. A tray could be elegant, but someone still had to wipe its surface, inspect its fittings, and place it where a porter could lift it without disturbing the bowls. Let us enter these service spaces gently, without pretending that one surviving register describes every day of the dynasty. This is a calm composite, drawn from the kinds of offices, provisions, and objects preserved in court records. In such a reconstruction, the hour before cooking began was not empty. It was filled with preparation so quiet that it could almost disappear from history. A storekeeper might begin with a key, a seal, or the presence of another responsible worker. Doors protecting grain, tea, seasonings, vessels, and fuel were not simply opened because someone felt hungry. Supplies belonged to an administrative system. A written allowance could authorize what was issued, while a clerk made a mark beside an office, a date, or a category of goods. Exact practices varied, but the principle was patient and repetitive. The material entered the palace account before it entered a pot. In a cool room, sacks rested against raised supports where air could move beneath them. One may reasonably imagine the dry whisper of grain against woven fiber as a measure was filled, leveled, and emptied into a smaller container. Nearby, jars held seasonings protected from damp. Bundles of vegetables brought from beyond the palace walls waited to be sorted. Meat and other perishable supplies required different handling, while tea remained dry and carefully contained. The Forbidden City was not sealed away from farms, markets, estates, workshops, roads, wells, and transport routes. Its kitchens were the inner end of a long supply chain, not the beginning of one. That chain included water. Records of court provisioning describe water brought from Jade Spring for high court use. It would be too broad to say that every vessel in the palace was filled from that one source, but documented transport itself reveals a quiet burden. Water is heavy. A full jar asks for a balanced shoulder, a secure cart, or several steady hands. It sloshes when the ground changes. In cold weather, spilled drops stiffen at the rim. In summer, the carrier feels the damp of the container and the warmth of the air at the same time. Before a cup of tea could seem effortless, water had crossed distance. Before it reached a lacquered stand or a porcelain bowl, it had been drawn, moved, received, stored, and heated. A tea room needed more than tea leaves. It needed clean vessels, controlled heat, cloths, lids, trays, and enough attention to serve the right place without confusion. The aroma that finally rose from a cup was the last light sign of work already completed by many hands. The kitchens themselves would not all have sounded alike. One room might have held the soft rush of washing rice. Another might have been concerned with broth, pastry, tea, or dishes suited to a particular household or occasion. A service room for guards did not share the same purpose as one preparing a high court presentation. Separate offices reduced some confusion, though they also multiplied the need for labels, messages, schedules, and carrying routes. At a stove, heat gathered gradually. Depending on the room and period, workers managed coal or wood and watched the draft with practiced attention. They did not need flames to leap dramatically. A useful fire could be modest, steady, and contained. A stove worker learned the difference between heat that brought water toward a simmer and heat that wasted fuel. Ash accumulated beneath the work. Soot settled where warm air found the ceiling. On winter mornings, the front of the body felt the stove while the back still remembered the cold corridor. Rice passed through several small transformations. Dry grains clicked against a bowl. Water clouded as the grain was turned and rinsed. A worker tipped the vessel with care, keeping the rice while letting the pale water run away. The filled pot grew heavier. Steam later softened the air and dampened nearby wood. None of these actions was unique to a palace, yet within the palace they were enclosed by rank, protocol, and accounting. An ordinary grain entered an extraordinary administrative setting and still had to be washed in an ordinary way. Court registers could list formal daily allocations of staples, meat, vegetables, seasonings, tea, water, and other provisions. These numbers belong to entitlement and administration. They should not be mistaken for a literal description of everything placed before one person and consumed. An allocation could support a table, attendance, presentation, choice, hospitality, ritual expectation, or the wider machinery of a household. What looks extravagant on a page may be telling us how an office categorized responsibility rather than what vanished from a single plate. For the clerk, however, the category mattered. A figure copied incorrectly could create trouble later. The brush was lifted, moistened, and brought down in a measured stroke. The paper weighted under a small weight. A name, room, or type of provision had to remain legible enough for another person to check. Kitchens depended on cooks, but they also depended on people who seldom touched the food. The clerk, storekeeper, messenger, porter, vessel keeper, and fuel carrier formed a web around the stove. The pace was active without needing to be hurried in our telling. A cook examined vegetables and separated damaged leaves. Another worker trimmed roots, washed surfaces, and gathered the useful pieces into a bowl. A knife met a board in a low, regular rhythm. Lids lifted and returned. Ladles rested with their handles turned away from the hottest edge. Cloth protected a hand from a warm vessel. Across the room, a worker counted bowls again, because one missing bowl could delay a tray more effectively than any grand command. Bowls were objects of service as well as beauty. Court collections preserve porcelain, metalware, lacquer, boxes, vessels, and utensils that hint at the material richness surrounding meals. Yet an object could only serve if it was clean, intact, and available. A chipped rim, a loose handle, or a lid that no longer sat correctly required notice. Some objects returned to storage. Others might be sent for repair. The kitchen therefore touched the workshop world even before our path reached it. Imagine, only as a bounded reconstruction, a tray being assembled on a broad table. The tabletop has been wiped. A folded cloth lies nearby. The bowls do not arrive all at once. One is placed, then another, while a supervisor or experienced servant considers order, temperature, and destination. Covers keep warmth in and dust out. A small dish is moved half the width of a hand so that the tray balances more comfortably. The adjustment leaves no mark in an official history, but practical work has always been full of such adjustments. Carrying demanded its own knowledge. The shortest route was not always the permitted route. Doors, courtyards, rank, weather, and the movement of other servants shaped the path. A tray carrier had to walk steadily over stone and across thresholds. In winter, covered dishes lost heat with each stretch of open air. In summer, steam joined the warmth beneath sleeves. At a doorway, the carrier might pause while identity, destination, or readiness was confirmed. Even food passed through the palace as controlled movement. Tea followed a related but distinct rhythm. Leaves were measured and kept for moisture. Water temperature mattered, though methods and preferences differed. Cups and pots were warmed, rinsed, arranged, and carried. The fragrance could be delicate, but the work supporting it was sturdy. A jar had weight. A kettle had heat. A tray had edges that pressed into the hands. When tea finally stood beside a seated figure, the workers who made that calm scene possible had already stepped away. Not every meal was an intimate moment. Court food could be tied to ceremony, seasonal observance, hospitality, or the formal display of order. On such occasions, coordination became more visible. Additional vessels might be removed from storage, checked, and placed in sequence. Ingredients had to be ready at the proper stage. Messages moved between offices. Still, the same small actions carried the day. Water was poured. Knots were opened. Surfaces were wiped. A fire was fed a little at a time. At other moments, the work was less ceremonial and more sustaining. Guards needed provisions. Princes and separate households had their own arrangements. Inner and outer court needs did not collapse into one identical menu. The division of food rooms reflected the division of palace life. It also meant that a delivery recorded for one office should not be casually assigned to everyone who lived or worked behind the walls. The workers themselves were equally varied. Some were skilled cooks. Some tended fires or washed vessels. Some carried water, fuel, ingredients, or finished dishes. Some kept stores and records. Eunuchs could serve as liaisons and supervisors in parts of the inner palace system, while other personnel belonged to offices with their own hierarchies. We cannot turn them into one nameless kitchen staff. Their duties met around the meal, but their positions and responsibilities were not interchangeable. There was also the patient work of waiting. Dough rested, water heated. A covered pot remained over a low flame. A carrier stood ready because the receiving room was not ready. A clerk waited for confirmation before closing a line in a register. Palace labor was not constant visible motion. It included attention held quietly in place, the ability to notice a change in steam, scent, sound, or instruction. The senses offered useful signs. A pot beginning to simmer spoke in small taps against its lid. Rice nearing readiness changed its smell. Fuel settling in a stove made a muted crack. The surface of hot liquid trembled before it rolled. A worker who had repeated the task for years could read these signs without making them dramatic. Skill often looked like calm. Season altered everything at the edges. In the cold months, water had to be protected from freezing and food from cooling too quickly along open passages. Fingers stiffened around handles. Warm rooms attracted condensation. In summer, perishable supplies demanded prompt care. Kitchens held heat, and insects had to be kept from stores. Spring brought different produce, while autumn carried its own harvest rhythms. The palace calendar was ceremonial, but it was also practical, because ingredients came from landscapes that changed month by month. The accounting calendar continued beside the seasonal one. Supplies were issued, received, consumed, returned, spoiled, or redirected. Surviving records may reveal categories more clearly than sensations. They preserve the administrative skeleton of a meal. From that skeleton, we can cautiously restore a quieter human outline. A storekeeper bends toward a seal. A porter shifts a load from one shoulder to the other. A cook rubs warmth into the fingers before lifting the next lid. Leftovers require particular care in our imagination. It is easy to tell a simple story in which every excess dish followed one fixed path, but court practice varied, and the records do not support one universal ending for all food. Some remaining provisions may have been redistributed according to rules or custom, while waste, spoilage, and return were matters of administration. The safe point is quieter. Food that had been issued still had to be noticed after service. Someone counted vessels, cleared tables, sorted what remained, and made the room ready again. The returning tray was different from the departing tray. Its covers had been lifted. Bowls might be partly empty, untouched, or exchanged. A smear of sauce marked a rim. A cup had cooled. The carrier brought these objects back through corridors that had already changed since the outward journey. Sunlight had moved across the stone. A courtyard that had been busy could now be still. At the kitchen door, the tray entered another sequence of receiving, clearing, washing, checking, and storing. The movement of containers mattered as much as the movement of food. Jars, baskets, covered boxes, and carrying poles had to remain matched to their purpose. An empty vessel still occupied space and still belonged somewhere. A basket arriving from outside might pause at a service point before its contents traveled farther inward. A sealed container might need to be opened in the presence of the proper worker. These boundaries helped the household know where responsibility passed from one set of hands to another. In a palace of many courtyards, custody was a path made visible through ordinary objects. Even the smallest ingredients could reveal this structure. Salt, oil, tea, and seasoning were easy to scatter and difficult to recover once carelessly handled. They were kept in suitable containers, issued in workable amounts, and protected from damp or contamination. Their value did not come from dramatic rarity alone. It came from regular usefulness, because the kitchen needed them again and again through a long sequence of mornings. Washing was not a minor conclusion. Warm water loosened oil. Cloth moved around curved porcelain and under the lip of a lid. Metal needed drying. Lacquer asked for gentler handling. A vessel decorated for court use remained an accountable object even when it was dirty. A worker inspected the surface, set it in a safe place, and resisted the temptation to stack too quickly. In a busy institution, care was a form of economy. Broken or worn objects opened a path toward other workers. A bent fitting, cracked box, damaged tray, or loose hinge could be recorded and sent for attention. Repairs did not always require a new commission. The life of court property included repeated inspection, mending, refinishing, reassignment, and return. A kitchen bowl and a workshop tool belonged to different tasks, but both traveled through systems of custody. Fuel also left a remainder. Ash cooled beneath the stove. Charred fragments were separated from material that might still burn. The stove worker reduced the draft and watched for danger. Palace collections preserve fire-lighting tools and many kinds of domestic objects, reminders that flame required management from its beginning to its end. A warm meal was followed by the uncelebrated labor of making the fires safe. Storehouse rooms changed as the day passed. Morning abundance became smaller stacks and open containers. The clerk's page acquired more marks. The floor gathered a little dust from sacks and shoes. Before doors were secured, quantities were checked as closely as circumstances allowed. The purpose was not perfect modern inventory control. It was continuity. Tomorrow's kitchen needed to know what remained tonight. There is comfort in the repetition. The palace appears in paintings and photographs as gates, roofs, halls, and long lines of symmetry. Yet inside that symmetry, daily life depended on rounded bowls, uneven vegetables, splashing water, soft grain, smoky sleeves, and handwritten records. Grandeur rested upon materials that refused to become grand. Water was always heavy. Ash was always dusty. A hot lid still required a cloth. The people doing this work could experience fatigue, discipline, pride, boredom, cold, heat, and concern in ways the official documents only partly reveal. We should not invent private thoughts for them. We can, however, respect the duration of their labor. A provision entered on paper might take hours of lifting and movement before it became part of a service. The quiet meal at the far end of the route was made from time as much as from ingredients. As afternoons softened, the kitchens did not simply stop. Some rooms prepared for later service. Tea continued to move. Supplies were put away. Cloths were rinsed and spread. A final vessel might arrive late from a distant courtyard. The stove retained warmth after the busiest cooking had passed, and the air held a faint mixture of grain, smoke, damp wood, and cooling metal. Beyond the food rooms, another kind of patience waited. Objects that had loosened, cracked, tarnished, or gone out of fashion could pass toward the Imperial Workshops. New commissions also began there, sometimes with an instruction, sometimes with a design, sometimes with an older object offered as a model. The kitchen and the workshop shared the habits of counting, custody, materials, and return. There is no hurry at all as we leave the last covered bowl and follow a small damaged fitting toward the rooms where artisans worked. The stove settles behind us. The ash grows pale, the water in the washing basin becomes still, and footsteps fade along the cooling stone. One door closes softly over the stores. One lamp remains beside the register. The warmth of the kitchen thins into the quiet of the corridor. The corridor beyond the kitchen carried less warmth. A small metal fitting, wrapped so that its edges would not scratch another object, moved toward a different part of the palace system. It might have belonged to a box, a tray, a piece of furniture, or a clock case. We do not need to decide which one. Its importance lies in the journey. When court property wore down, the answer was not always immediate replacement. An object could be inspected, recorded, repaired, altered, returned, and used again. The Imperial Workshops administered through the Imperial Household Department occupied different places in and around the inner palace complex at different times. They were not one timeless room where every court object was made. Specialized work was divided, supervised, and documented. Artisans worked beside a less visible company of clerks, storekeepers, supervisors, messengers, and eunuch liaisons. Regional craftspeople and European specialists also entered parts of this world, bringing knowledge that could be adapted to court commissions. The result was not a single style of labor, but many kinds of skill moving through one administrative web. Let us follow the wrapped fitting at an unhurried pace. This is another bounded reconstruction, shaped by workshop archives that preserve commands, designs, manufacture, revisions, packaging, and display. No surviving line allows us to hear every hammer stroke. The documents do show that beautiful objects often emerge from slow procedure rather than sudden inspiration. The fitting first needed a responsible receiver. A package placed on a work table without a record could easily become a problem. A storekeeper or clerk noted the object, its source, its condition, or the instruction accompanying it, according to the practice of the office and period. The wrapping was opened, cloth folded away from metal. Under soft daylight, a worker turned the piece and found the place where wear had thinned an edge or loosened a joint. An artisan might understand the repair immediately, while a supervisor still needed to decide whether the proposed work matched the command. Skill and authority met at this point. The artisan knew materials. The supervisor knew the office. A eunuch liaison might carry information between the workshop and inner court, where access was controlled. A clerk transformed spoken decisions into a trace that could be checked later. No single person made the process complete. Court workshop archives are unusually patient records. They preserve not only finished splendor but also instructions to make, compare, change, present, package, or place an object. A design could be submitted and returned. A model might be approved in part and revised in part. A completed piece could be judged unsuitable and sent back for alteration. The path from request to display therefore bent and doubled back, not in drama, but in careful correction. The fitting on our table needed material. Metal stock had to be issued from storage rather than appearing at the artisan's elbow. The amount might be modest, but it remained accountable. A small strip was selected. Tools were laid out. We may imagine, within reasonable limits, a file, a hammer, a gripping tool, and a surface able to bear repeated work. The exact equipment depended on the object and workshop. What all crafts shared was preparation. The useful tool had to be sharp, clean, and close at hand. Metal answered touch differently from jade, lacquer, glass, wood, or porcelain. It could ring under a light blow and warm slowly in the hand. Filing left fine particles that had to be gathered from the work surface. Edges demanded attention because a rough repair could damage the surrounding object. An artisan adjusted pressure by feel. A movement too forceful might create more work. A movement too timid might change nothing. Nearby, another commission could involve jade. The court valued jade objects, and palace workshops participated in their design, finishing, mounting, repair, or coordination with expert production beyond the palace. Stone carving required abrasives, time, and a close reading of the material. Jade did not yield in soft curls like wood. Its surface changed through repeated contact, the form emerging gradually. Dust mixed with water into a pale residue. The worker's progress could be measured in small differences of contour and polish. In another room, lacquer demanded a different patience. Lacquer work could involve layers, drying, polishing, carving, inlay, or the coordination of prepared parts, depending on the object. A layer applied too heavily could spoil the surface. A layer touched too soon could preserve the mark of impatience. Time itself became part of the material. The workshop could not command a surface to dry faster merely because a palace instruction had arrived. Glass brought its own history of exchange. Qing court workshops became places where Chinese artisans and specialists from farther away worked with techniques, forms, and designs that did not remain neatly separated. European experts served at court in several artistic and technical roles, while regional craftspeople were recruited for skills already refined elsewhere. The palace did not create all knowledge within its walls. It drew people and materials inward, then asked them to work within court expectations. This exchange is especially visible in clocks. Court collections preserve elaborate mechanical clocks that joined moving figures, enamel, metal, glass, sound, and decorated cases. Some arrived through tribute or trade. Some were associated with overseas makers, and some were worked on or produced within court systems. A clock that pleased the eye could still stop. Springs, gears, pivots, hands, cases, and decorative mechanisms required inspection. Repair made the hidden artisan briefly more important than the visible ornament. Imagine a clock room without making it noisier than it needs to be. Several mechanisms do not all strike together. Most of the time, the sound is smaller, a close ticking, a faint release of pressure, the soft placement of a tool. A specialist leans toward an open case. Light catches a wheel. A clerk waits to record the outcome. Outside the room, the palace measures time through duties and gates as much as through clock hands. Furniture moved through workshop attention as well. A stool might need a repaired joint. A cabinet door could drag at its hinge. A carved stand might require refinishing after long use. Court furniture could be made from costly materials and shaped with great refinement, but its practical life still included weight, friction, dust, and uneven floors. A repairer examined where force traveled through a frame. The quiet creak of wood offered information. Porcelain followed yet another route. Much ceramic production occurred in major regional centers rather than entirely within palace walls, with court demands shaping designs, standards, and delivery. Once vessels entered palace custody, however, they could be counted, stored, matched, displayed, used, and sometimes fitted with components or incorporated into larger arrangements. This is another reminder that the workshops belong to networks. Palace artisans, outside specialists, regional producers, transport workers, and officials all contributed to what later appeared as one court object. The archives sometimes describe staffing in a particular institutional setting, including supervisors, storekeepers, clerks, liaisons, and a substantial body of artisan labor. Such a description must remain tied to its own time and office. It cannot become a fixed total for the entire Qing dynasty. People entered, left, transferred, aged, learned, and were replaced. Workshops expanded or contracted. The administrative label remained more stable than the human group beneath it. Training also took several forms. Some knowledge passed through families or regional traditions before an artisan came near the palace. Some developed through years beside senior workers. A specialist might arrive already known for a particular craft. Another worker could become reliable through repetition rather than fame. The records favor commands and objects, yet every smooth, joined, and balanced pattern rests upon practiced eyes and hands. Our small fitting is now ready for comparison with the original object. It is held against the worn place. The curve is nearly correct, but the edge stands slightly proud. The artisan removes it, returns to the bench, and files again. This is the quiet center of workshop life. Not the first idea, and not the final praise, but the second attempt, the closer fit, the adjustment so modest that a later viewer may never know it happened. Approval could travel in stages. A drawing, sample, model, or partly completed piece might be presented before further labor was authorized. The person carrying it needed appropriate access. The receiving court servant needed to understand what was being shown. A comment returned, sometimes in very few words, and the workshop translated that comment into a change of material or form. Archives preserve this back and forth because commands were acts of administration as well as taste. An instruction to make something larger, smaller, simpler, brighter, more closely matched, or differently mounted was only the beginning. The supervisor interpreted it. The clerk recorded it. The storekeeper issued more material if needed. The artisan altered the work. The liaison carried it again. Each transfer offered a chance for delay or misunderstanding. So labels, wrapping, boxes, and written notes mattered. Packaging was itself a workshop concern. A finished surface could be ruined on the way to the hall. Soft cloth protected polish. A fitted box held an object away from its walls. Cord secured a lid. The outside could bear a label that connected the package to a command or destination. We may picture hands pressing the folded cloth into corners, then lifting the box slightly to test its balance. The object was complete, yet still not safe until movement had been considered. Display added another layer. A vessel, clock, screen, box, or furnishing needed a place that suited both its appearance and its function. A stand might be commissioned to raise it to the right height. A pair needed to face correctly. A mechanical object required space for movement. A box intended for use had to remain accessible. The palace interior was assembled through countless decisions that joined craft to placement. Then the cycle could begin again. Dust settled. Silk faded. Hinges loosened. Metal tarnished. A clock slowed. A furnishing moved to another room. Court property was not frozen at the moment of completion. It aged within a living institution. Storekeepers received it back. Clerks found earlier entries. Artisans saw the work of predecessors and decided how much to preserve. Repair carried a particular humility. The finest repair might disappear into the object. A replaced pin remained hidden. A polished edge did not announce the hours spent upon it. The artisan's success could be measured by how little the court noticed. This invisibility resembles kitchen work. When the bowl arrived warm and intact, the carrier vanished from the scene. When the clock moved smoothly again, the repairer also receded. The workshop day was shaped by the body. Eyes tired after close work. Fingers grew stiff in winter rooms. Dust found cuffs and seams. Repeated pressure left tenderness in the hand. Workers paused to clear a bench, wood a stone, sweep particles, or adjust the light. We cannot assign one precise routine to all crafts, but we can acknowledge that every object cost attention, posture, and time. Light mattered greatly. Fine surface work needed enough daylight to reveal scratches and unevenness. On darker days, the workers shifted closer to a window or lamp, within the limits of the room and the task. A polished metal edge caught amber light. Lacquer reflected it softly. Glass divided it. Jade seemed to hold a cooler glow. These are reconstructed sensations, but they follow the properties of the materials rather than fantasy. Sound separated the workshops as surely as their materials. Metal gave a controlled tap. wood responded with a lower note. Abrasive work made a muted scrape. Cloth whispered across a finished surface. A clock ticked. A drawer closed. Conversation could be practical and brief, because attention belonged to the hands. Beyond the walls, courtyards absorbed the sharper sounds and returned them as faint echoes. Smell offered another map. Freshly worked wood carried a dry warmth. Lacquer and adhesives required care and ventilation suited to their use. Metal work brought traces of oil, heat, and fine dust. Packing cloth held the cleaner scent of stored fiber. None of this combined into one permanent workshop atmosphere. The palace contained many rooms, each changing as a task began, paused, dried, cooled, or ended. The presence of European and regional specialists did not turn the workshop into a simple meeting of separate worlds. Knowledge moved through adaptation. A foreign mechanism could receive a courtly case. A regional technique could be shaped to an imperial design. Chinese artisans could learn from unfamiliar tools while specialists from abroad worked within Chinese administrative commands. Objects became records of collaboration, negotiation, and selective borrowing. That collaboration was not always equal or easy. Palace service imposed hierarchy and deadlines. Materials could be difficult. Instructions could change. A craftsperson's judgment might be overruled by preference from above. The archives let us see procedure more readily than emotion. It is enough to notice that beauty was produced within structures of authority, not in a peaceful world outside them. Storekeepers stood at the center of this structure more than display labels usually admit. They knew what material had entered, what had been issued, what remained, and what object waited for collection. Scraps could still possess value. Tools belonged to the office. Models and patterns might need to be retained. A well-ordered shelf saved hours of searching, while a missing component could halt several workers. Clerks kept another kind of shelf, one made from paper. Commands accumulated. Dates, materials, names, revisions, and destinations formed a memory beyond any single artisan. A later instruction could refer back to an earlier object. A repair might begin with the discovery of an old entry. The archive was not created for our bedtime journey, yet it now allows us to see work that finished objects conceal. Designs required their own acts of translation. A spoken wish was too loose for several specialists to follow, so a drawing, measured note, sample, or older model could give the request a stable form. The person preparing it selected which view would make the shape clear. A curve seen from the front might look different from the side. A decorative border had to meet itself neatly at the corner. When more than one workshop contributed to an object, shared measurements allowed a metal mount to fit a wooden body, or a glass panel to sit within a prepared frame. The beauty of the whole depended on agreements made before the parts met. Materials also carried histories before they reached the bench. Timber came from forests and merchants beyond the capital. Stone had been quarried, selected, and transported. Pigments, abrasives, metals, glass ingredients, cloth, cord, oils, and paper all arrived through wider networks. The Imperial Household Department could direct and account for supplies, but it could not make distance disappear. A fine piece of material represented the labor of people who would never enter the palace. Workshop care began with recognizing that replacement could be slow or costly. Tool maintenance formed a quieter craft within every craft. A blunt blade pulled where a sharp one cut. A damaged abrasive surface produced uneven work. A clogged file left scratches. Handles loosened under repetition. At intervals, an artisan stopped making the commissioned object and attended to the means of making it. Edges were restored, surfaces cleaned, cords checked, and tools returned in an order that the hand could remember. These minutes rarely appear in descriptions of court luxury, yet without them the splendid commission remained only an instruction on paper. Waste was noticed as well. A short strip of useful metal, a sound piece of wood, or a fragment suitable for testing might be retained. Dust and filings had to be cleared, particularly when one material could mar another. Fragile pieces were separated from heavy tools. The workshop bench was not simply tidied for appearance. Order protected labor already invested in unfinished work. When several commissions shared a room, their parts needed clear boundaries. A label stayed with a bundle. Wrapping kept matched pieces together. A supervisor decided which task should advance and which could wait. One artisan might pause because a design had not returned from review, then turn to a repair already approved. In this way, waiting did not always mean stillness. The workshop flowed around delay, carrying smaller tasks forward until authority, material, or a missing component arrived. As evening approached, active tasks reached different stopping points. A metal piece could be wrapped after inspection. Lacquer might be left undisturbed to settle. A clock case was covered against dust. Loose tools returned to assigned places. Valuable material was counted or secured. A clerk completed a line while enough light remained to read it. Our fitting, now repaired, traveled back in its cloth. It no longer caught against the edge of the object. The joint sat quietly. A receiver checked it, and the box, tray, furnishing, or clock returned to palace use. No fanfare followed. The repaired thing simply resumed its place among other things, bearing the nearly invisible evidence of workshop labor. Farther along the court, preparations for performance drew on many of the same hands and habits. Costumes needed fittings. Boxes needed hinges. Stage objects required repair, paint, cloth, metal, and careful storage. The theater appeared alive with music and movement, but behind it stood the same slow disciplines of inventory, maintenance, wrapping, and return. There is no hurry as we leave the artisan's bench and follow the folded cloth toward the court theater. The final tool is wiped clean. A shallow tray of pale dust rests untouched, and the small ticking of a clock continues after the room has grown dim. One by one, the work surfaces disappear into shadow. A storehouse key turns with a restrained click. The last reflection on polished metal narrows, softens, and is still. The folded cloth from the workshop passed into another room where fabric carried color rather than dust. Court theater flourished under the Qing, supported by institutions of the Imperial Household Department whose names and arrangements changed over time. The Southern Bureau and its later successor, the Shu, managed aspects of performance, training, administration, and records. They did not remain identical across the dynasty, and no single surviving costume can give us one universal schedule. Together, however, the archives and objects reveal a world of labor behind the painted face, the embroidered sleeve, and the music heard across a palace courtyard. By the time a performance began, much of that labor was already complete. Roles had been learned. Movements had been practiced. Costumes had been found, aired, inspected, and placed in order. Headwear, boots, belts, fans, weapons made for the stage, and other properties waited near the people responsible for them. A court audience might see a bright figure step into view. Behind the screen, a keeper saw ties, seams, labels, boxes, and the possibility of a missing piece. We can walk through this final part of the night without assigning it to one exact date. The sequence is a bounded reconstruction based on the institutions, marked costumes, daily objects, and guarded spaces that survive in records and collections. Particular performances differed in scale and purpose. Some belonged to festivals or celebrations, some to selected court occasions, and rehearsals followed their own patterns. Our attention remains with the workers who made performance possible and then returned the palace to quiet. A costume laid across a table was not merely decoration. Surviving court garments include internal markings that identify palace use, evidence of custody behind display. A keeper opened the fabric carefully and looked for strain where one section met another. Embroidery added weight. Long sleeves required room. Fastenings had to hold during measured movement and release when the garment returned to storage. A small weakness noticed early could be sent for repair before it became a torn seam. The costume might represent a general, an official, a spirit, a scholar, or another theatrical character, but the person handling it before the performance considered practical matters. The front must face the right way. Layers must be arranged in the order they would be worn. A belt must be near the robe it completed. A headpiece should not be crushed beneath something heavier. The keeper read the garment not as a story, but as a sequence of actions. Performers also worked through sequences. Court theater drew on established dramatic and musical traditions, and training demanded repetition. A gesture that looked broad from the audience could be built from careful placement of hand, foot, sleeve, and gaze. A sung phrase rested upon breath, learned over time. Musicians watched one another and responded to cues. Practice shaped the surface until effort seemed to disappear. Institutions such as the Southern Bureau and, later, the Shengpingshu handled more than the moment on stage. Their administrative and archival roles remind us that theater generated paper. Personnel, repertoire, instruction, scheduling, costumes, and properties all required forms of organization that varied across periods. The palace performance was an event, but it was also an office at work. A clerk could know a costume by a designation that meant little to the audience. A storekeeper knew which box held its headwear. A dresser knew which time must remain loose until the final layers settled. A performer knew how far the sleeve would continue after the arm stopped. Each person held a different map of the same role. In the dressing space, sound remained close. Cloth brushed cloth. A wooden box opened. A fastening clicked softly against a table. Instructions were spoken at a practical volume. Powder and pigment were prepared according to the theatrical practice of the time and role. A mirror returned a face becoming more formal, more distant from daily service, though the hands applying color still worked through familiar motions of measure, pressure, and correction. The air carried the dry scent of stored textiles and wood. In cooler weather, fabric felt cold when first lifted. Heavy layers gradually held the body's warmth. In summer, the same layers could become tiring before the performance began. We need not invent a performer's private thoughts to understand the physical fact. Court splendor had weight. Stage properties carried weight as well, though some were designed to suggest more than they contained. A box could stand for treasure. A painted object could indicate a distant place. A fan could become breeze, message, screen, or extension of a hand. Theatrical meaning transformed simple things, yet the property keeper still had to count and return each one after the scene. The performance space itself changed according to palace, occasion, and period. Qing court theater included purpose-built stages and varied settings. Some stages allowed elaborate forms of presentation, while smaller occasions could require less. We do not need to place every opera on the grandest structure. In our reconstruction, A prepared court stage waits beneath controlled light, its boards cleared, its entrances kept open, and its nearby passage guarded from accidental interruption. Musicians settle with their instruments. Strings are checked. Percussion rests until the proper cue. A performer waits beyond the audience's view, feeling the costume shift with each breath. The first sound does not explode into the night. It arrives from preparation, joining a space already made ready by cleaners, lamp tenders, property keepers, attendants, and guards. For those watching, the performance might offer history, legend, virtue, comedy, celebration, or auspicious display. For those working, it brought a chain of timed duties. An entrance had to remain clear. A garment adjustment had to be made before the next appearance. A property leaving one side needed to be available later. Lamps required attention. A message might pass quietly behind the stage while the visible story continued. Court theater could be magnificent, but magnificence did not remove routine. Someone swept the boards. Someone inspected a platform edge. Someone carried a box that looked ordinary when closed. Someone waded through a long section because one brief task would come near the end. The hidden side of performance contained more stillness than an audience usually imagined. Lamps gave the evening a second architecture. Palace collections preserve many forms of lamps and related daily objects, alongside tools associated with making and managing fire. The exact lighting arrangement varied by room, occasion, and period. Yet every flame required fuel, a wick or comparable source, protection from drafts, and human attention. Light was not a background condition. It was work. A lamp tender approached with a steady hand. A flame too low failed its purpose. A flame too high smoked, wasted fuel, or threatened nearby material. Glass, metal, paper, textile, and wood each responded differently to heat. The tender noticed soot, trimmed or adjusted what was necessary, and kept loose fabric away. The safest light was often the least dramatic, a small amber presence held within boundaries. Mirrors extended that light. Metal fittings caught it. Embroidery returned it in broken points. A lacquered box held a soft reflection, while a porcelain vessel gave back a cooler gleam. Fans, boxes, textiles, fire tools, and other utensils appear in palace collections because ordinary court life depended upon objects of many kinds. Some were made in Imperial Workshops. Some came from regional production or tribute. Whatever their origin, once they entered service, workers had to know where they belonged. The performance reached its conclusion without needing a final shock. The last gesture settled. Music drew inward. A figure left the visible stage, and the audience's attention moved elsewhere. Behind the screen, work changed direction. Preparation became recovery. Objects that had traveled outward now began to return. The performer stood while a dresser loosened the outer layers. A belt was placed flat rather than dropped. Long sleeves were supported so that their weight did not pull at a seam. A headpiece returned to a stand or fitted space. Makeup could be removed. The person beneath the role reappeared slowly, while the role remained in cloth, paint, and memory. Costume keepers examined garments before folding them. A fresh mark, loosened thread, missing fastening, or damp area required notice. Folding followed the needs of the textile rather than haste. Embroidered surfaces were protected from hard creases where possible. Pieces that belonged together remained together. Internal markings and records helped return palace property to the right custody. Some textiles needed time before a box could close around them. Cloth warmed by the body or touched by damp night air benefited from careful airing within the possibilities of the room and season. A keeper could spread a layer, support its heavier sections, and wait while attending to another piece. This was not delay for its own sake. Stored moisture encouraged damage, while careless exposure invited dust or fading. The useful middle course depended on experience. Palace costume care was a practice of avoiding small harms before they accumulated. Accessories demanded separate attention. Beads, metal ornaments, stiffened panels, and delicate extensions could press into softer fabric if packed without thought. A missing tie might seem trivial until the next dressing began. The keeper counted, matched, and nested components so that weight rested where the object could bear it. A shallow box received one headpiece. A wrapped bundle received another. Labels gave each silent shape a place in the institutional memory. Not every item went directly back to a shelf. A damaged ornament might be separated for repair. A garment needing attention could be tagged or placed aside. A property with a loose joint returned toward the workshops we had just left. This is how the palace day formed a circle. The workshops served the theater generated repairs, and storekeepers held the objects between one use and the next. Musicians cared for their instruments in quieter ways. Strings relaxed. Surfaces were wiped. Small components were gathered. A case closed around something still faintly warm from the hands. The instrument did not become silent because the music ended. It gave a final wooden touch or a soft settling note as it returned to rest. The stage was cleared in an order that made tomorrow possible. Large properties moved first or last according to practical need. Smaller pieces were counted. A fan no longer represented wind. It was again a painted and folded object with an assigned box. A stage weapon no longer represented authority or danger. It was a crafted property to be inspected, wrapped, and stored. A clerk's work could continue after the audience had gone. A mark confirmed return. A note preserved damage or absence. The page did not capture applause, melody, fatigue, or the sensation of heavy robes. It recorded the information the institution required. Because such administration survived, we can now glimpse the people behind the performance more clearly than we otherwise could. There was no single moment when the whole palace became dark. Different rooms ended their duties at different times. Some lamps were extinguished. Others remained for necessary service. Watchmen and guards continued their shifts. Personnel moved through allowed passages according to identity, rank, duty, and the controls of the palace. Exact routes and closing times varied and cannot be restored as one universal nightly routine. In a reconstructed corridor, a lamp tender shields a small flame from a draft and passes beneath the painted beams. The light moves over stone, then disappears around a corner. Behind another door, a storekeeper waits while the final theater box arrives. Its cord is checked. Its label is read. The box joins others in a room that smells faintly of wood, cloth, and dust. The key turns. A seal or other office procedure may secure the storage according to the rules of its place and time. Responsibility passes from the returning worker to the person keeping the room. This transfer resembles the kitchen store at the end of service and the workshop store at the end of craft. Palace quiet was built from many small acts of custody. Elsewhere, used lamps waited for care. Soot could be wiped away after surfaces cooled. Fuel supplies had to be ready for another evening. Fire lighting tools returned to a box or shelf. A vessel that had held water was emptied or covered as needed. The objects of night did not maintain themselves. Darkness also required workers. Fire safety linked distant rooms. The theater had cloth and painted surfaces. Storehouses held timber, paper, and textiles. Kitchens held fuel and retained heat. The exact inspections differed by office and period, but careful workers understood the common danger. A glowing fragment, an unstable lamp, or a stove left too active could threaten far more than one task. Attention continued after visible use ended. A hand hovered near a surface to sense lingering warmth without touching it. A lamp was watched for another moment. Ash was spread or contained until its condition was clear. This watchfulness did not need alarm. It belonged to closing, as ordinary as returning a key. The palace grew safer through pauses, through one additional look at a wick, a brazier, a door, or a covered vessel. Quiet was not the absence of work. It was often the result of work completed carefully. Courtyards changed character as flames diminished. Roof tiles lost their amber edges. Red walls deepened toward brown and then toward shadow. The pale stone of a terrace held the last suggestion of light. A breeze moved through an open space more freely after doors closed. These sensations are reconstructed, but their materials remain true to the place. Timber, tile, stone, cloth, metal, and night air. Footsteps became easier to distinguish. During the day, many movements overlapped. Now one could hear a porter returning without a load, a guard changing position, or an attendant crossing toward a final duty. Soles met paving in a slow rhythm. The sound approached, passed, and faded, leaving the courtyard larger than before. At controlled passages, doors and gates required attention. Guards worked in shifts, and entry or movement within the palace depended on rules of rank and identity. Earlier in our journey, before dawn, officials had dismounted where regulations required, presented badges bearing identifying information, and continued on foot beyond specified points. The checking of a badge and the opening of a gate were forms of labor then. They remained forms of labor now, after theater robes had been folded away. We return gently to that first gate. It does not need to be the last gate closed in an exact historical sequence. It is the gate that frames our composite day. Before dawn, its hinges moved while the court still slept. At night, a different shift stands near the same heavy leaves, listening to the final authorized footsteps approach. A person leaving follows the identification or permit procedure suited to that role and moment. The guard checks what the rules require, recognizes the authorization, and allows the passage. No one needs to speak loudly. The gate admits or releases movement, then settles back toward stillness. Wood carries its weight into the sockets. Metal fittings answer with a low restrained sound. The worker who passes through may not live inside the palace. Artisans, specialists, suppliers, performers, and other personnel belong to different arrangements, and we should not imagine them all sleeping permanently behind the walls. The Forbidden City depended upon roads and households beyond it. At the gate, the inner court met that wider city one person and one object at a time. Inside, night guards continued. Their patrol routes and precise timing varied, so our steps remained deliberately general. A guard watched a doorway, listened across a courtyard, and noticed whether a light stood where duty required it. Another shift would eventually replace this one. The labor of protection did not end when the visible ceremonies ended. The palace now held the traces of all 6 parts of our journey. At the gate, a badge had been checked. In the inner court, palace maids had managed cloth, tea, appearance, and property within rank-shaped service. Eunuchs had carried messages, tended doors and lamps, learned rules, and worked through the pressures of hierarchy. Kitchen workers had turned supplies and records into trays. Artisans had repaired and made court objects through repeated approval. Performers and keepers had brought a painted world to the stage and folded it away again. None of these workers was interchangeable with another. Their duties, status, access, training, and conditions differed. What joined them was not a single servant identity, but the administrative reach of the Imperial Household Department and the practical dependence of court life upon specialized labor. The palace appeared orderly because people renewed its order every day. The surviving record is uneven. It tells us more about offices, regulations, objects, and commands than about private feelings. It preserves some names and loses many others. We should not fill every silence with invention. Instead, we can remain with the work itself. A bowl lifted, a message delivered, a seam checked, a gear adjusted, a lamp lowered, a door secured. There is comfort in this modest scale. History often remembers the person seated at the center of a hall. Tonight, we have stayed near the edges, where a carrier balanced a tray and a keeper folded a sleeve. The court depended on these edges. Without them, the center could not remain calm. The final theater lamp grows smaller. Its keeper waits until the flame is safely gone, then touches only what is cooled. A faint line of smoke rises, bends, and disappears into the darker air. The last box rests on its shelf. The last footsteps cross the stone. At the gate where our night began, the guard settles into the quiet of the next watch, while the great doors stand still beneath the roofs. There is nowhere else we need to go. Let the workshops remain dim, the kitchen ash settle, the folded costumes rest, and the corridors empty into sleep. Thank you for spending the night in history with me. I'm the Yawning Historian. Good night.